Hollywood lied to you. It wasn't about the grand strategy, the dramatic poses on the bridge, or the glorious, triumphant sinking of enemy dreadnoughts. If you want the truth, the raw, unfiltered, deeply ugly truth of the Pacific War, you don't look at the battleships. You don't look at the aircraft carriers. You look at the tin cans, the destroyers. And you don't look at the medals. You look at the fingernails of the boys who served on them, bitten down to the quick, torn, bloody, from gripping steel bulkheads in the pitch dark while the ocean tried to swallow them whole. We have this highly sanitized, heavily produced image of the US Navy in World War II. Crisp white uniforms, gleaming decks, men standing tall against the horizon. But talk to the guys who actually rode the destroyers. Talk to the ones who survived. The ones who wake up 40 years later sweating through their sheets. They'll tell you a different story. They will tell you about a floating, violently vibrating, freezing, boiling metal tube where sleep was a myth, and the primary smell was a gut-churning cocktail of diesel fuel, stale sweat, vomit, and the sharp metallic tang of pure adrenaline. Let's get one thing straight right now. A destroyer wasn't built to keep you safe. A battleship had armor a foot thick. It was a floating fortress. A destroyer? A destroyer was built for speed, agility, and cheap, rapid production. The hull of a typical Fletcher-class destroyer was just about 3/8 of an inch thick. 3/8 of an inch. That's less than half an inch of unarmored, mild steel separating the soft, fragile human bodies inside from the crushing pressure of the Pacific Ocean and the high-explosive warheads of Japanese torpedoes. That's why the sailors called them tin cans. Because that's exactly what they were. You were practically riding inside a soup can strapped to a massive screaming pair of steam turbines. If a piece of shrapnel hit a battleship, it bounced off. If it hit a destroyer, it went right through the bulkhead, right through the mess deck, and right through anyone standing in the way. But the lack of physical armor wasn't the cruelest part. The cruelest part was the psychology of the job. In the Navy's grand tactical playbook, aircraft carriers were the queens of the chessboard. They were the multi-million-dollar assets that projected power and won the war. Battleships were the kings. Destroyers were the pawns. Their official job was screening. Sounds protective, right? Sounds noble. But let's translate screening into blunt behavioral reality. Your job as a destroyer sailor was to be the bait. You were the human tripwire. You were stationed miles away from the main fleet, alone in the dark, so that when the Japanese dive bombers, the Kamikazes, or the submarine wolfpacks came looking for the valuable carriers, they found you first. The Navy's unspoken strategy was mathematically ruthless. Better to lose a $3 million tin can and 300 expendable farm boys from Kansas and Brooklyn than lose a $50 million carrier and its elite air wing. You knew it. The captain knew it. The guy puking his guts out next to you in the cramped berthing compartment knew it. You were completely expendable, and going to sleep every night with the deep, subconscious realization that your own command structure considers you the acceptable loss that breaks a man's mind in ways a bullet never could. Imagine the physical reality of living on one of these ships. Just the sheer agonizing physical toll before a single shot is even fired. Destroyers were narrow. They sat low in the water. They didn't ride over the waves. They violently smashed through them. And a heavy sea in the Pacific is notorious for typhoons that could literally snap ships in half. A destroyer didn't just rock. It snapped back and forth with a violent whiplash motion. 30 degrees to port, 40 degrees to starboard. Snap. 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 For days on end, you couldn't walk. You had to crawl. You couldn't eat from a plate. You drank lukewarm coffee and soup from a heavy mug while wrapping one arm around a steel stanchion just to keep from being thrown across the room and breaking a rib. The seasickness wasn't just a temporary discomfort. It was a debilitating physiological breakdown. Guys would puke until there was nothing left but dry heaves and burning green bile. And then they had to go topside and stand a 4-hour watch in a freezing, spray-soaked gun mount, staring into the black ocean until they hallucinated. There was no respite. The noise was constant. The relentless, high-pitched scream of the forced draft blowers feeding the boilers. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the twin screws turning. The ship vibrated so intensely that it would shake the fillings right out of your teeth. Try sleeping when your metal bunk is vibrating like a jackhammer. The air is thick with the stench of 300 unwashed bodies. and the ship is pitching so violently you have to literally tie your own body to the mattress to keep from being thrown onto the steel deck. You didn't sleep. You just passed out from sheer biological exhaustion. And then, there's the isolation, the unique psychological torture of the unknown. If you were an infantryman in a foxhole, you could see the enemy. You could shoot back. You had dirt to hide behind. You had some illusion of agency. On a destroyer, especially for the guys working below decks in the engine rooms and the boiler rooms, you had zero agency. You were a blind rat in a steel maze. Let's go down there for a second. Put yourself in the shoes of a snipe, a machinist's mate, or a boilerman. You are 3 decks down, well below the waterline. The temperature in the engine room is 120 degrees on a good day. It hits 130, sometimes 140 in the South Pacific. You are wearing a heavy denim shirt, slick with sweat, deafened by the roar of the superheated steam turbines. Suddenly, the general quarters alarm goes off. Bong, bong, bong. That sound, that god-awful, heart-stopping electronic gong. It doesn't mean danger might be coming. It means people are actively trying to kill you, right now. And what do? If you're below decks, you dog the hatches. Let that sink in for a moment. Standard procedure during combat is to seal the ship to prevent flooding. That means you, the 19-year-old kid from Ohio, reach up and turn the heavy steel wheel on the hatch above your head, locking it tight. You are sealing yourself inside. You are physically welding your own coffin shut. You can't see the sky. You can't see the Japanese dive bombers rolling over into their attack dives. You can't see the torpedo wake streaking through the water directly towards your bulkhead. All you can do is listen. You listen to the 5-inch guns on your own deck slamming away, shaking the rust off the pipes above your head. You listen to the frantic, panicked chatter on the sound-powered telephones. And you wait. You wait for the sudden, catastrophic roar of steel tearing. You wait for the wall to simply vanish in a flash of blinding white fire. You know with absolute certainty that if a torpedo hits your space, the ocean will rush in with the force of a freight train, and because you dawed that hatch shut, you are never getting out. You will drown in the dark, tangled in jagged steel and boiling oil, thousands of miles from anyone who even knows your name. That was the daily reality, the agonizing, drawn-out, suffocating anticipation of death. By 1945, off the bloody coast of Okinawa, this psychological torture reached its absolute peak. The Japanese knew the war was lost. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were just trying to take as many Americans with them as possible. They unleashed the Kamikazes. And who do you think was stationed on the radar picket lines, 50 miles away from the main invasion force, completely alone? The tin cans. The destroyers were put out there specifically to catch the Kamikazes before they could reach the troop transports. Imagine standing on the open deck of a destroyer, scanning the gray horizon. The radar picks up a swarm of bogies. Dozens of them. They aren't trying to bomb you and fly away to fight another day. They're trying to physically crash their airplanes into your deck. They are flying bombs guided by human beings who have already made peace with their own deaths. You are firing everything you have. The 5-inch guns, the 40mm Bofors, the 20mm Oerlikons. The sky is black with cordite and flak. The noise is so loud your ears bleed. The ship is violently swerving, throwing a huge white wake, trying to dodge planes that are literally falling out of the sky on top of you. And you look around at your crewmates, boys who are 18, 19, 20 years old. Faces black with smoke, eyes wide with a kind of primal, animalistic terror that Hollywood has never, ever been able to capture on film. Because right then, in that moment, patriotism doesn't matter. The grand strategy doesn't matter. The brass in Washington doesn't matter. All that matters is the incoming dot in the sky, growing larger and larger, screaming down toward the bridge. The reality of the destroyer sailor wasn't about surviving the war. It was about surviving the next 5 minutes, over and over and over again, until the odds finally caught up with you, or your mind simply gave way under the crushing, invisible weight of the terror. But what happens when the odds run out? What happens in the first 3 seconds after a kamikaze turns a ship from a weapon of war into a burning slaughterhouse? 0.3 seconds. That is the exact physiological delay of the human brain's startle response. It takes 0.3 seconds for your retinas to register a flash of light, send a signal to your amygdala, and for your body to realize it is in the process of being destroyed. when a 5,000-pound Mitsubishi Zero, carrying a half-ton armor-piercing bomb and hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, slams into the thin steel deck of a destroyer at 350 miles per hour, there is no cinematic slow motion. There is no time to scream. There is only a kinetic transfer of energy so violently absolute that it defies human comprehension. The ship doesn't just explode. It ruptures. It melts. It folds in on itself like crushed tin. In that fraction of a second, the psychology of the crew undergoes a catastrophic, irreversible paradigm shift. You are no longer a sailor fighting a war. You are biological matter trapped inside a high-speed metal blender. Let's talk about the fire. Because Hollywood shows you explosions, bright, orange, rapidly dissipating fireballs that throw stuntmen onto safety mats. That is a lie. The reality of a kamikaze hit is aviation fuel. Hundreds of gallons of it, aerosolizing instantly upon impact, shooting through the narrow passageways and ventilation shafts of the destroyer. It doesn't just burn. It seeks. It finds the oxygen in the confined spaces and consumes it in a thermobaric flash. If you are standing in a passageway when that flash rolls through, the air in your lungs literally combusts. Men didn't just burn to death. They were atomized. Those who survived the initial blast wave were immediately thrust into a sensory nightmare that breaks the human mind faster than physical trauma. The lights go out, total suffocating darkness. The air instantly fills with thick, black, choking cordite smoke and the sweet, sickening smell of pulverized meat and melting wiring. The deck beneath your feet is suddenly slanted at a grotesque 30-degree angle, slick with blood, seawater, and raw hydraulic fluid. This is where the true psychological horror of the tin can sailor begins. This is where we stop talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and start talking about something much darker, much more permanent, moral injury. PTSD is a physiological reaction to profound fear. Moral injury is a fracturing of the soul. It happens when you are forced to commit an act, or witness an act, that violates your deepest moral foundation. And on a dying destroyer, moral injury wasn't an accident. It was standard operating procedure. It was called damage control. Picture this. You are a 22-year-old damage control officer. The ship has taken a hit below the waterline. The sea is rushing in with the pressure of a fire hose, thousands of gallons a minute. The ship is listing heavily to port. If the flooding isn't stopped, the ship capsizes, taking all 300 men straight to the bottom. You run to the watertight bulkhead door. You grab the heavy steel wheel to dog the hatch shut, to seal off the flooding compartment and save the ship. But there are men still in that compartment. Your friends. The guys you played poker with last night. The guys whose wives' names you know. You can hear them in the darkness on the other side of the steel, thrashing in the rising water, screaming for help, slamming their bloody fists against the metal. You have 5 seconds to make a mathematical calculation that no human being should ever have to make. 12 lives on that side of the door. 200 lives on this side of the door. So what do? You shut the door. You spin the wheel. You lock it tight. You physically seal them in a steel tomb and listen to them drown. You listen to the frantic pounding slow down, weaken, and finally stop. You save the ship. The Navy will pin a medal on your chest. But your brain just logged a murder. You will carry the sound of those fists hitting the steel bulkhead every single night for the next 50 years. You will wake up screaming, smelling the rust, feeling the cold steel of that wheel in your hands. That is the invisible tax of fighting in a tin can, and sometimes even sealing the bulkheads isn't enough. The list gets worse. The fires reach the magazines where the ship's own ammunition is stored. The captain gives the 2 most terrifying words in the naval vocabulary: abandon ship. Except the loudspeakers are dead. The comms are shredded. The order is passed by word of mouth through the choking black smoke, shouted by men coughing up blood. You crawl topside. The ship you called home is a twisted, burning slaughterhouse. You slide down the slanted deck, ripping your fingernails on jagged shrapnel, and you jump into the Pacific Ocean. But you don't hit water. You hit Bunker C. Destroyers run on heavy Navy fuel oil, a thick, viscous, toxic black tar. When a ship ruptures, thousands of gallons of this sludge bleed out, creating a slick on the surface of the ocean inches thick. And because the ship is burning, the oil slick is burning. You jump from a burning steel deck into a literal lake of fire. If you don't jump far enough, you land in the flames. You have to dive under the water, swimming blind through the dark, salty depths, your lungs screaming for oxygen, hoping that when you finally break the surface, you swam past the fire line. When you do come up, the oil coats everything. It coats your hair, it coats your eyes, blinding you, stinging like acid. You gasp for air and swallow mouthfuls of salt water mixed with toxic bunker fuel, causing you to vomit violently while desperately treading water. Your K-pop life jacket, if you were lucky enough to grab one, becomes waterlogged, weighing you down, dragging you toward the abyss. And then, the ship goes down. The $3 million war machine, the pride of the fleet, groans like a dying animal. The stern rises high into the air, the massive brass propellers completely exposed, spinning uselessly against the sky. The hissing of superheated steam meeting cold seawater is deafening. And then, she slips under. The violent, deafening chaos of the last hour vanishes in an instant. The water violently rushes in to fill the void, creating a suction that drags men down with her. If you survive the suction, if you survive the fire, if you survive the toxic oil, you pop back up to the surface. And it is quiet, terrifyingly, absolutely quiet. There are no dive bombers anymore, no screaming turbines, no roaring 5-inch guns, just the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, the black sky, the cold water, and the bobbing heads of the survivors, covered in thick black tar, coughing up oil, bleeding into the water. You are alone. You are floating 1,000 miles from nowhere. The battle has moved on without you. Your physical war is over, but as the adrenaline finally begins to drain from your system, leaving you shivering uncontrollably in the dark, the psychological war, the one that will haunt you until the day you die, is just beginning. Because out here in the cold, black water, drifting aimlessly as the blood from the wounded begins to spread out, carrying a scent for miles in every direction, you quickly realize that the Japanese were only the first threat. The ocean has predators of its own, and they have just been invited to dinner. You don't hear them coming. That is the first, most terrifying lesson of the Pacific Ocean. Hollywood has conditioned you to expect a soundtrack, a dorsal fin, cutting the surface like a knife, a dramatic splash. Reality doesn't give you a warning track. Reality is pitch black, dead silent, and cold. You are treading water in a thick, suffocating slick of bunker C fuel oil. Your eyes are burning so badly from the toxic sludge that you can barely keep them open. You are shivering uncontrollably, your teeth clicking together like castanets, because even in the South Pacific, the water temperature will slowly, methodically suck the core heat right out of your organs. And then, you feel it. A bump. Not a bite. Not an attack. Just a solid, abrasive nudge against your dangling legs, like a piece of heavy, waterlogged timber drifting into you in the dark. Except timber doesn't circle back and nudge you again. In the psychology of survival, there is a specific moment where the human ego shatters. On the deck of that destroyer, you were a petty officer. You were a gunner's mate. You had a rank, a serial number, a dog tag, and the backing of the United States government. You were an apex predator firing high explosive shells. The second you hit the water, you were demoted. You instantly tumbled to the very bottom of the food chain. You became nothing more than a slow, bleeding, thrashing piece of protein bobbing in the dark. The primary predator out here isn't the great white. It's the oceanic whitetip. They are the scavengers of the deep ocean. They don't strike out of anger or territorial defense. They are ruthlessly, mechanically opportunistic. They are drawn by the low-frequency vibrations of hundreds of panicking men thrashing in the water, and by the heavy metallic scent of human blood mixing with the salt water. The psychological torture of the oceanic whitetip is its patience. They don't swarm in a frenzy, at least. Not at first. They test. They bump your legs with their snouts to see what you are. They scrape their sandpaper-like skin against your calves. You can't see them. You can only feel the water shift around you. You hear the guy 20 yards away suddenly stop mid-sentence. He doesn't scream. He just gasps. A sharp intake of air, and then he is violently jerked downward. The water churns for a few seconds. A thick, dark bubble of blood breaches the oil slick, and then the agonizing silence returns. Who is next? Is it the guy holding onto the debris next to you? Is it you? You pull your knees up to your chest, cramping your abdominal muscles until they spasm, trying to make yourself as small as possible in an ocean that has no bottom. You are suspended over miles of black, crushing depth, waiting for the teeth in the dark. But the sharks are only the night shift. When the sun finally breaches the horizon, you realize the true scale of the nightmare. Daylight doesn't bring salvation. It brings the magnifying glass. The Pacific sun is merciless. It beats down on the ocean's surface, reflecting off the water and the oil slick, baking you from above and below. You are covered in toxic black tar. It has filled your pores. It is matted in your hair. As the sun cooks the oil onto your skin, it begins to chemically blister you. Your life jacket, the standard issue Kapok vest, was designed to keep you afloat for about 48 hours, but it's bulky. The canvas collar, stiff with dried salt and toxic oil, violently chafes the back of your neck with every single wave. After 12 hours, the skin on your neck is rubbed completely raw, bleeding openly into the salt water. Every wave is a splash of pure acid on an open wound. And then, the ultimate irony of the shipwrecked sailor sets in: death by dehydration while completely submerged in water. By the second day, the thirst is no longer a physical sensation. It is a full-blown neurological crisis. Your tongue swells, turning black and cracking like dried mud. Your throat feels like it is packed with ground glass. Every instinct in your hominid brain, evolved over millions of years, is screaming at you to just open your mouth and drink the crystal-clear blue liquid surrounding you. This is where the behavioral psychology of the group begins to fracture. Hypernatremia salt toxicity is a brutal way to lose your mind. It starts with a whisper, a guy floating next to you. A quiet kid from Iowa who hasn't said a word in 8 hours suddenly starts muttering about how cold the beer is in his refrigerator back home. You tell him to shut up. You tell him not to drink the water, but the desperation overrides the logic. He cups his trembling, oil-stained hands, brings the seawater to his cracked lips, and drinks. Within hours, the salt acts like a poison to the central nervous system. The brain cells literally begin to shrink as the salt draws the water out of them. The hallucinations start. You watch, completely helpless, as men you trained with, men you bled with, completely disconnect from reality. They don't look panicked anymore. They look terrifyingly calm. "I'm just gonna run down to the mess deck and get a cold Coca-Cola," one of them says, his eyes glassy and completely unseeing. "I'll be right back." Before you can grab him, he unclips his life jacket. He slips it off his shoulders, gives you a polite nod, and simply swims down into the black abyss. He doesn't struggle. He doesn't come back up. The ocean just swallows him whole, erasing him as if he never existed. Madness is contagious. When you are floating in a desperate cluster of 50 men, panic spreads like a virus, but surrender spreads even faster. Watching a man willingly drown himself plants a dark, insidious seed in your own exhausted mind. Why am I fighting this? My legs are numb. My skin is burning. The sharks are circling. If I just unclip these buckles and exhale, it will all be over in 2 minutes. The pain will stop. That is the true battle of the tin can survivor. It's not fighting the Japanese. It's not fighting the ocean. It is the minute-by-minute, agonizing war against your own brain, which is rationally trying to convince you that suicide is the most logical option. And the Navy? The command structure? They don't know where you are. Destroyers on picket duty were isolated by design. Radio silence was strictly enforced to avoid enemy detection. When a kamikaze hit and pulverized the radio room in a fraction of a second, no distress signal went out. You are floating in an area of ocean the size of Texas. You are a speck of debris. Sometimes the ultimate psychological cruelty is a false hope. Around noon on the second day, you hear it, the distant, unmistakable drone of Pratt & Whitney engines, a PBY Catalina flying boat or a Corsair on patrol. The adrenaline hits your exhausted system like a thunderbolt. Men who haven't moved in hours suddenly thrash in the water, splashing, waving their oil-soaked shirts, screaming through cracked throats. Here, we're down here. Look down. The plane flies directly overhead. So close you can see the rivets on the fuselage. So close you can see the pilot looking out the canopy. And then, it just keeps flying. It fades into a tiny dot on the horizon, and the drone of the engines gets swallowed by the sound of the wind. They didn't see you. From 2,000 feet up, 50 men covered in black oil bobbing in dark blue water are completely invisible. The crash that follows that false hope is devastating. That is the moment the weeping starts. Not the loud, dramatic sobbing of a movie, but a quiet, broken, hopeless whimpering. The sound of human spirits finally snapping under the weight of utter abandonment. You are forced to watch the men around you die, one by one, not in a blaze of glory, not taking an enemy machine gun nest, but dying from exposure, from madness, from exhaustion, and from the unseen things pulling them under by their ankles. There is no dignity in it. There is only endurance. And for the few, the very, very few who manage to survive long enough to see the gray hull of a rescue ship finally break the horizon on the third day, the nightmare isn't ending. It's just changing shape. Because the boys who went into the water are dead. The things that are being pulled up those cargo nets, trembling, coughing up black oil, and staring right through the medics. Those are just ghosts inhabiting human bodies. You think the rescue is the happy ending. You've been conditioned by a century of cinema to believe that the moment the sailor's oil-slicked hand grabs the rough hemp of the cargo net, the music swells. The violins kick in. The nightmare is over. The war is won. And the screen fades to a comforting, triumphant black. Erase that from your mind. Being pulled from the Pacific Ocean didn't mean you were saved. It just meant you were no longer actively drowning. The physical war ended the second your boots hit the steel deck of the rescue ship. But the psychological slaughter? That was just punching its time card. Let's talk about the mechanics of salvation. Because there is absolutely nothing gentle about it. When you are hauled up over the railing after 3 days in the water, you don't stand and salute. You collapse like a sack of wet meat. Your muscles have completely atrophied from hyperthermia and relentless spasming tension. Your joints are locked. Your eyes are swollen shut from the salt water in the fuel. And then comes the decontamination. You cannot simply wash Bunker C heavy fuel oil off a human body. It is a thick, carcinogenic tar that is baked into your pores under a magnifying tropical sun. Normal soap is useless. Hot water just smears it. To get it off you, the medics lay you down on a freezing steel deck, and they use rags soaked in diesel fuel. Imagine that. You have just survived a burning ship. You are severely dehydrated. Your skin is blistered from the sun and chafed raw by your life vest, and now another human being is scrubbing you down with raw diesel fuel and stiff bristled brushes. They literally have to scour the top layer of your epidermis off just to find the man underneath the sludge. You scream, you thrash, but you have no voice left. Only a dry, raspy wheeze comes out of your cracked throat. When they finally strip away the oil, the salt, and the blood, they wrap you in blinding white sheets and lay you in a clean, quiet bunk in the hospital ward. And that is when the absolute paralyzing horror of survival truly sets in. Because for the last 72 hours, your brain was entirely consumed by a singular primal objective. Do not swallow the water. Keep kicking. Watch the fins. Survive the next breath. Your central nervous system was running on a lethal overdose of adrenaline and cortisol. But now you are horizontal. Now it is quiet. Now the humming of the ship's engines isn't a threat, it's just background noise. The adrenaline abruptly crashes, leaving a massive gaping void in your neurochemistry. And into that void rushes the tape recorder. You close your eyes, craving the oblivion of sleep. But the second your eyelids shut, the projector turns on inside your skull. You don't dream, you hallucinate. You hear the deafening crack of the kamikaze hitting the superstructure. You feel the violent, sickening lurch of the deck giving way. You smell the flash-fried wiring and vaporized blood. Most terrifying of all, you hear the voices. You hear the 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn who begged you to hold on to his hand just before a swell tore him away in the dark. You hear the rhythmic, desperate pounding of fists against the watertight door you dogged shut. You open your eyes, gasping, chest heaving, soaking the clean white sheets in a cold, toxic sweat. You look around the dimly lit medical ward. You see 20 other men sitting bolt upright in their bunks, staring straight ahead. Nobody is talking. Nobody is crying. They call it the 1,000-yard stare. But that term is too poetic. It's too soft. It implies they are looking at something far away. They aren't looking at the horizon. They are looking inward. They are actively watching their own souls rot. They are calculating the exact mathematical weight of survivor's guilt. Why me? Why did the shrapnel miss my neck by a fraction of an inch and decapitate my best friend? Why did the shark pull into the mechanic who had 3 kids in Ohio? Instead of me, An 18-year-old high school dropout with nothing to lose. There is no answer. The universe is terrifyingly random, and realizing that the universe does not care about fairness, goodness, or courage is a psychological virus that completely dismantles a young man's worldview. But the Navy doesn't have time to treat your soul. They patch your skin, rehydrate your organs, pin a Purple Heart on your fresh, crisp uniform, and put you on a train back to the United States. Welcome to 1945 America. This is the era of the ticker tape parade. This is the era of the VJ Day kiss in Times Square. The country is completely, intoxicatingly drunk on victory. They defeated global fascism. The boys are coming home. The economy is booming. You step off the train in your hometown. Your mother is crying. Your father pumps your hand, chest puffed out with pride. The local newspaper wants to take your picture. The girl you left behind wants to get married next week and buy a little house with a white picket fence. Everyone is smiling. Everyone wants to slap you on the back and buy you a beer. Tell us about the war, son. Give it to those Japs, didn't you? How do you answer that? How do you stand in a brightly lit, sterile American diner, smelling hot coffee and cherry pie, and explain to a grinning insurance salesman what a man looks like when his lungs are filled with burning aviation fuel? How do you tell your mother that you are technically a murderer because you locked 12 of your friends in a flooding compartment to save a piece of floating steel? You don't. You realize instantly, with a crushing sense of isolation, that you are a ghost haunting your own life. You look like the boy who left, but you are a completely different species now. You have seen behind the curtain of human civilization. You know exactly how fragile the meat is, and how quickly the rules of morality evaporate when the water starts rising. So, you do what millions of World War II veterans did. You swallow the grenade. You smile for the camera. You take the job at the Ford assembly plant. You marry the girl. You have 3 kids. You mow the lawn on Sundays. You participate in the great American post-war masquerade. But the triggers are everywhere. They are relentless, invisible landmines buried in the mundane landscape of civilian life. You are at a 4th of July barbecue. Someone throws too much lighter fluid on the charcoal grill. The sudden whoosh of ignition, the smell of accelerating fuel. And instantly, you aren't in Ohio anymore. Your heart rate violently spikes to 180 beats per minute. Your hands shake so badly you drop your beer. You have to physically restrain yourself from diving under the picnic table. You're trying to sleep next to your wife. Outside, a thunderstorm rolls in. A heavy clap of thunder rattles the window panes. To her, it's just weather. To your fractured amygdala, it is the sound of a 5-inch gun firing. It is the sound of a kamikaze breaching the hull. You bolt upright, drenched in sweat, your fists clenched, ready to fight for your life. Your wife wakes up, terrified, asking what's wrong. You look at her. You love her. But you cannot bridge the gap. You just shake your head, walk to the kitchen in the dark, and pour yourself 3 fingers of cheap bourbon. Because in 1946, there is no language for this. Psychology in the mid-20th century was brutally primitive. If you lost a leg, you were a hero. You got a pension. But if you lost your mind, if you couldn't sleep, if you drank yourself into a stupor every night just to quiet the screams, that wasn't an injury, that was a character flaw, that was weakness. Shell shock was a term reserved for the poor bastards who spent years in artillery trenches, not for a sailor who spent a few hours in the water. You were supposed to be a man. You were supposed to just get over it. So the tin can sailors drank. They worked 80-hour weeks to exhaust themselves so thoroughly they wouldn't dream. They built walls around their emotions so thick that their own children grew up thinking their fathers were just cold, distant, angry men. They carried the secret weight of the dark water for 50, 60, 70 years. They carried it right to the grave. The most tragic casualty of a sinking destroyer wasn't the ship itself. It wasn't even the men who drowned. The ultimate tragedy was the boy who physically made it back to the surface, but whose mind was permanently anchored 3,000 fathoms deep, forever trapped inside a steel can, waiting for a door to open that never, ever will. The cruelest trick of the human brain isn't forgetting. It is what happens when the firewall finally collapses. For 50, 60, maybe 70 years, the tin can sailor built a massive, reinforced concrete dam inside his own mind. He used work. He used alcohol. He used the stoic, silent father routine to hold back an ocean of black water, burning oil, and the faces of dead 19-year-olds. He was the perfect post-war American man. He paid his taxes. He bought the station wagon. He never complained. But the brain is a biological machine, and machines eventually break down. When a World War II veteran hits his 80s or 90s, cognitive decline begins. The prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational part of the brain responsible for suppressing trauma and maintaining that 1950s masquerade, starts to physically shrink. It weakens. It loses its grip. And the amygdala, the primal fear center where the sights, sounds, and smells of the kamikaze strike were permanently burned into his neural pathways, that part stays completely intact. So, the dam breaks.
Help us. Somebody help us, please.
This is the hidden, agonizing final chapter of the destroyer sailor's life. Hollywood doesn't make movies about the nursing home. But if you want to understand the true cost of the Pacific War, you have to walk down that sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. You find an old man, frail, weighing maybe 130 pounds, sitting in a wheelchair. He doesn't know what year it is. He doesn't recognize the daughter sitting next to him holding his paper-thin hand. Because he isn't in 2026. He is permanently, irrevocably trapped in 1945. The nurses think he's just suffering from sundowner's syndrome. They don't understand why. Right around dusk, he starts screaming at them to dog the hatches. They don't understand why he violently bats away a cup of water, terrified that if he drinks it, the salt will make him hallucinate. They don't understand why a dropped metal bedpan down the hall makes him dive out of his wheelchair, shattering his fragile hip on the linoleum floor, desperately trying to take cover from a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb. They medicate him. They sedate him. But you cannot drug away a moral injury. In his final days, the silence he maintained for his entire civilian life is finally broken. But it's not the heroic war stories his family always wanted to hear. It is the raw, unfiltered terror. He speaks to empty corners of the room. He apologizes to ghosts. He cries out for the boys he left behind the watertight doors. He begs for forgiveness from a kid named Tommy from Chicago, a kid whose face has been perfectly preserved in his mind for 3/4 of a century, forever 19, forever drowning in the dark. His family watches this, horrified, entirely unequipped to process the trauma pouring out of their grandfather. They look at the shadow box hanging on his bedroom wall, the velvet background, the neatly pinned ribbons, the bronze star, the purple heart. They always looked at those medals as symbols of glory. They never realized that a medal is just a government-issued receipt for a piece of a man's soul. It is a piece of ribbon given in exchange for asking a human being to absorb a level of horror that the human mind was never evolved to withstand. We did these men a massive disservice. We called them the greatest generation. Journalists coined the term. Politicians weaponized it. We printed it on bumper stickers and carved it into marble memorials. It sounds like the ultimate compliment, doesn't it? It wasn't a compliment. It was a gag order. By labeling them the greatest generation, we stripped them of their right to be human. We turned them into flawless marble statues. And statues don't bleed. Statues don't cry in the middle of the night. Statues don't drink half a bottle of Jim Beam just to stop their hands from shaking. We demanded that they be heroes, which meant we refused to let them be victims. We demanded the sanitized, triumphant narrative of defeating the Axis powers. And in return, we implicitly told them, keep the ugly part to yourself. We don't want to hear about the burning oil. We don't want to hear about the sharks. We want the parade. So, they gave us the parade, and they swallowed the poison. When the end finally comes, it is usually quiet. The heart simply gives out, exhausted from a lifetime of carrying a weight no one else could see. Then comes the funeral. The military honors are pristine. Everything is perfectly choreographed. The crisp white gloves of the honor guard, the sharp, mechanical precision of the rifle volley 3 volleys of 7, cracking sharply in the cold cemetery air. The mournful, lingering notes of taps echoing off the headstones. The flag draping the casket is perfectly clean. The red is vibrant, the white is spotless, the blue is deep and absolute. 2 young sailors, kids the exact same age he was when he stepped onto the steel deck of that tin can, fold the flag. 13 tight, rigid triangles. They press it into the hands of the grieving widow or the oldest child. On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. It is beautiful. It is respectful. It is utterly disconnected from the reality of what he actually did. There is no bunker C fuel oil on that flag. There is no blood. There is no vomit, no salt water, no shredded skin. The ceremony is the final coat of paint on the Hollywood myth. It is the final sanitization of a profoundly dirty, brutal, and unforgiving reality. The casket is lowered into the ground, and the dirt covers the man who survived the unsurvivable. But the truth doesn't get buried with him. The truth is what you are reading right now. The truth is that freedom isn't just paid for with courage or patriotism. It is paid for with pulverized bone, with shattered minds, and with the agonizing screams of boys trapped inside sinking metal tubes at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The next time you see a black and white photograph of a World War II destroyer cutting through the waves, do not look at it as a majestic weapon of war. Look at it for what it was: a floating slaughterhouse, a 3/8-inch thick steel coffin. And the next time you think of the men who rode those tin cans into hell, do not picture the square-jawed, fearless action heroes of the silver screen. Picture a terrified farm kid covered in black grease, holding his breath in the dark, waiting for the torpedo to hit. Picture a man treading water in a burning ocean, watching his friends lose their minds and slip beneath the surface. Picture a father silently drinking in his kitchen at 3 a.m. because the thunderstorm outside sounds exactly like the end of the world. Do not honor the myth. The myth is cheap. The myth is easy. Honor the terrifying, brutal, undeniable reality. Honor the fact that they were perfectly ordinary, deeply flawed, terrified human beings who were thrown into an industrial meat grinder, and somehow, against all mathematical odds and psychological endurance, they held the line. They didn't win the war because they were fearless. They won the war because they were absolutely mind-numbingly terrified, and they did their jobs anyway. That is the reality of the tin can sailor. And that is a truth Hollywood could never afford to produce.